And now for something completely different. Well, not entirely. We'll be touching on some issues we've already been hearing about today, but we are trying to shift our focus to a specific domain that introduces, I hope, a number of additional considerations into the debate. My name's Nick Saville. As Bennett says, I lead the Cambridge English Language Assessment team, which does the research into our English language exams. And since we administer more than 5 million exams with our partners around the world, we have access to large amounts of data which can shed light on what's going on in education systems in perhaps 100 plus countries. So the specific case we will be focusing on concerns the language proficiency, and in particular proficiency in English as a second language, as learnt around the world. This is perhaps a unique case, I would argue. As you know, English has become the world's lingua franca. And teaching and learning English now starts in elementary schools in most parts of the world, and the trajectory is a very long one, all the way through schooling, into education at the higher levels, and into the workplace. If you like, it's a lifelong learning challenge. And actually learning the language really matters to a lot of people. Perhaps at the heart of the differences that we are highlighting is that what ultimately matters at the end is the ability to use English for communicative purposes in society. Second language proficiency, in this case, is a practical skill that enables access to life opportunities in the workplace and in higher education. So do we see gender differences in attainment in learning English? Who is winning? Or is that actually not a very sensible question to ask? As I said, we're well placed to address this. So I brought along two members of my team. I'd like to introduce on my right, who's going to be speaking first, Agnieszka, who is a specialist in quantitative data analysis and will be presenting a case study. And on my other side, on my left, Ardeshir, who is the assistant director in the team, a psychometrician who is now the head of automated assessment and learning. Agnieszka is going to give, if you like, an example, a case study of older teenagers who are taking a test of English as a foreign language, which will be used for high-stakes purposes, for access to higher education, possibly for mobility to study through the medium of English. Following her analysis, Ardeshir will then throw out, if you like, some reflections on these analyses, hopefully leaving some food for thought for the debate which will follow. So posing more questions perhaps than answering them. So Agnieszka, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. If I could just get my presentation up, thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, Nick. Differences between boys and girls in educational attainment have been a topic of both political and academic discussions in the last decades. We have heard plenty of evidence today from our previous speakers that girls indeed outperform boys in a number of subjects. We have heard from Tom evidence from the UK that actually girls do perform better than boys in a wide range of GCSE subjects, with biggest differences in humanities and smaller differences in mathematics. Also, the PISA studies have shown that actually girls do better in reading, but slightly worse than boys in mathematics and science. What we were interested in at Cambridge English is whether we see a similar gender gap in attainment of English language proficiency. At Cambridge English, actually, we undertake attempts to construct unbiased tests. Actually, at the stage of test construction, we try to make sure that the questions that we would like to put into our exams do not contain any bias, so they do not disadvantage female candidates or male candidates. In addition, we conduct a number of statistical analyses, statistical and psychometric analyses, to make sure that questions perform uniformly well for our female and our male candidates. If we have a slight suspicion that questions might be disadvantaging male or female candidates, we withdraw those items from examinations, so these items do not enter the examinations at all. So the question that arises here is whether, in spite of all our attempts to construct unbiased tests in Cambridge English, whether we do still see a gender gap in attainment of English language proficiency. And we decided to test this hypothesis with data from an English language exam, a test of academic English, a widely popular one, IELTS. IELTS is a high-stakes exam that has been used for many years by many English-speaking countries for education, work, and immigration purposes. We decided to use data from IELTS exam here because of its high-stakes nature. We actually assume that candidates who subscribe to take this exam are well motivated to perform well on this exam. So basically, this test is the best proxy for us to measure the true ability level of candidates. We took a sample of candidates for our analysis here. We chose candidates who took the exam from January 2014 to January 2015 in this time frame. These candidates were aged between 16 and 19-year-old. These were candidates actually who started the test in the country where they have the residence of or where they have the nationality of. We also chose candidates who gave entry to higher education as a reason for taking this test. As a result, we have information on candidate performance from 35 countries around the world. We decided to take two approaches here to try to answer our research question about performance in English language proficiency between boys and girls. So we have two perspectives. Firstly, we looked at the global aggregate level pattern in performance between boys and girls. What I mean here is that we took the data from all 35 countries together to see how female candidates perform versus male candidates on the overall test, so the overall score in the test, across 4 skills: reading, listening, writing, and speaking. And also we had a look at how candidates perform in different age groups. Secondly, we decided to disaggregate the data to have a look at what are the differences between female and male performance on the test in each of the countries in our analysis. So we are looking here at the country level pattern. So we look at differences between boys and girls on the overall test and also across all 4 skills. So what do our results tell us? So is there a gender gap in attainment of English language proficiency as we saw in other subjects, in other studies? Let us first have a look at our aggregate level data. The graph that you see here shows us the proportion or percentage of female candidates in red and male candidates in blue across score bands of IELTS. So actually IELTS, we measure proficiency, English language proficiency in IELTS across 9 score bands, from 1 to 9, where 1 means basic level of English language proficiency and 9 means experienced advanced level of English language proficiency. And we also here have half bands, so 1.5, 2.5, and so on up till 9. So again, we are looking here at the proportion of female candidates and male candidates across each score band of IELTS. What we see in this graph is that at the lower levels of English language proficiency, in the low score bands, the proportion of female candidates is actually quite small. Let's have a look here at band 2. Proportion of female candidates is like 10%, but 90% of the candidates who scored 2 are actually male. The opposite we can see at the other spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum. So at the higher level of English language proficiency, the high band scores, the proportion of female candidates is very high. Here, for example, for band 8, the proportion of female candidates is around 60%, and 40% of the candidates in this band are male. So actually, girls tend to if they enter the test, they score higher, they achieve higher levels of English language proficiency. So this gives us the first indication that at the aggregate level, female learners display stronger English skills than male counterparts in the overall test. Let us now have a look at the patterns across individual skills. Again, we see here in the graph the proportion of female candidates in red and male candidates in blue across band scores for the reading section of the test. Again, we see a similar pattern. At the lower levels of English language proficiency, the proportion of girls is quite small, but at the higher level of proficiency, the proportion of girls is quite high. So basically, the further we go across band scores, the higher the proportion of female candidates is. So basically, girls do tend to score higher in the reading section of the test as well. What do we see in other sections? The same pattern. Listening, writing, and speaking, probably even more noticeable here in the writing section and in the speaking section. Obviously, there are so small deviations here. Again, this gives us an indication that female candidates actually do score higher also across individual skills in this test. This is a pattern across age groups. So we see proportion of female candidates and male candidates for the 16-year-olds here, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, and 19-year-olds. Again, the same picture. At lower levels of English language proficiency, the proportion of females is small, and at higher levels, the proportion of female candidates is higher, which again could lead us to the conclusion that female learners in all age categories perform stronger than male learners. So we have seen so far that when we aggregate the data from 35 countries, we do have some evidence that girls perform better than boys on the overall test and across skills. But the question is actually how much better are they than boys? This graph shows you the difference between the achievement of female candidates on the overall test and across skills and the achievement of male candidates. And this is measured by mean score band for female candidates minus mean score band for male candidates. Again, we see here the positive difference means that girls are better than boys. And indeed, all the differences are positive. So girls are better than boys on the overall test and across skills, but the magnitude of difference is actually not that big. The difference is smaller than half of a band and actually is oscillating around a quarter of a band. So although we do see that female learners are better than male learners, the magnitude of difference is actually quite small. Let us now delve into differences across countries. Let us unpack the data a bit more. As I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, we have here information on candidates from 35 countries. The countries highlighted in gray, these are the countries that entered our analysis. So we have information on a number of Asian countries, some European countries. In Africa, it's Nigeria and Egypt, and in South America, we have information on Brazilian candidates. Again, we were interested here in the difference between performance of girls and performance of boys, and we color-coded the difference. You will see it in a moment. In two countries, Pakistan and Bangladesh, interestingly enough, girls perform much better than boys, and the difference is bigger than half a band. In countries such as China, Sri Lanka, Kuwait, and Qatar, girls outperform boys, but the difference here is between a quarter of a band and a half of a band. In the vast majority of countries in our analysis, girls perform better than boys. This is on the IELTS overall test, but actually the difference is smaller than a quarter of a band. Interestingly, there are a number of countries where boys perform better than girls, and these countries are Brazil. In Europe, it's Lithuania, Romania, and Bulgaria, United Arab Emirates, Nepal, and Japan. What does it show us? Actually, this country-level analysis shows us that there is no consistent pattern in performance across gender. Girls perform better in certain countries, but not in others, and probably the global trend, the global pattern in stronger female performance that we saw at the beginning of my presentation is actually driven by strong female performance in only a few countries, and these countries are China, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Again, let us have a look at how boys and girls perform across different skills. So again, to get a more differentiated picture than just an average score in a test. Again, we looked here at the difference between performance of girls and performance of boys as measured by mean score across skills in each of the countries in our analysis. And we color-coded this, so basically if you see red, reddish, and yellow dots, these are the skills where girls perform better, and in blue we indicated that boys perform better. There are many countries, actually, where girls perform better across many skills. Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, Sri Lanka, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Russia, Saudi Arabia. There are many countries where we see a consistent performance of girls. They are better across all 4 skills. And there are many other countries in Asia where we see the same pattern. However, there are also a number of countries where we do see that girls perform better in certain skills, but not in others. So here in Kazakhstan, for example, we see girls are better in writing and speaking, but boys perform better in reading and listening. Again, there are many other countries where we see a very similar pattern. So basically, girls tend to perform better in writing and speaking, which are productive skills, and boys perform better in reading and listening. Let's have a look at Europe. When we looked at the overall score, actually in countries such as Spain, France, Italy, and Greece, we saw that girls perform better than boys. But a more differentiated picture appears if we unpack the data and look at performance across skills. Here in Spain, for example, girls perform better on writing and speaking, but boys perform better in reading and listening. Same pattern in France, with some deviations, obviously. And also Bulgaria and Romania. As you remember, I pointed out those countries because actually in the overall test, boys performed better. But again, when we look across skills, girls perform better in writing and speaking here, but boys perform better here. So again, like at the aggregate level, basically in a country, in the overall test, we see stronger male performance, but actually it varies when we look across individual skills. Lithuania, interestingly enough, is the only country where we see strong performance of boys across all 4 skills. And the same pattern holds in other countries that we included in the analysis. The country-level analysis across skills shows us, again, that there is no consistent pattern in performance across gender. So boys perform better in some skills, but girls perform better in other skills. Just to sum up the results of our data analysis, there is limited evidence for the gender gap hypothesis in English language proficiency. At the aggregate level, we saw that female learners perform better than male learners in the overall score and across skills, but the magnitude of difference was actually quite small. And the aggregate level pattern of stronger female performance is actually driven by strong female candidates in only a number of countries, such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, and China. When we look at the country level, a more differentiated picture emerges, and there is actually little consistency in performance of female and male candidates. Girls perform better in certain countries, but not in others, and they perform better in some skills, mostly the productive skills, such as writing and speaking, but not in others. Thank you very much for your attention, and now over to Ardeshir for the discussion of our results.
We'll ask Ardeshir. Thank you very much, Agnieszka. We'll ask Ardeshir if you could have about 6 or 7 minutes so we can keep on track. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'd like to reflect on this evidence and consider what might be happening here. As Nick said at the beginning of the talk, in what ways might English language learning in a global context may raise issues which are different from the ones that were discussed today. And also, what we like to say is that from the evidence, from the aggregated score, we could see that the girls appear to perform slightly better than male candidates, and would like to know why. What would that be? So that's the question that we'd like to look at. Now, if we go back to the data that Agnieszka showed you, we went too far. Sorry, one slide is missing. So I have to just tell you what that graph is. The graph is the graph you've seen earlier, which showed the distribution of scores at the aggregate level from 0, number 1, going to band 9. And you've seen that the boys were the majority of candidates at each level until it got to something like band level 6. And from band level 6, all of a sudden you see that there was a rise for girls at that level. Now, actually what happens over there is important. Traditional schooling system prepares the candidates up to the level of 4.5 and 5 in terms of the IELTS scores. But what you see in the context of purpose of use, which is academic environment, the minimum requirement is something about 6.5. And you can see that there's a big gap between what comes out of the schooling and what's required in the market, which is in this particular case, academic environment. And that's where the gap is, and that's where you see that all of a sudden girls appear to do better. So I'll get back to this at the end. What does it mean when you have more boys at the beginning, which doesn't matter, it's band 2, 3, and 4. Actually, they are on the low level of proficiency, but they don't matter at all. Now, assuming you've seen that graph, now we focus on language learning theories. Now, the important thing about language learning is that we need to understand the differences between the first language acquisition and second language learning, which is the case of the IELTS test takers. They're all second language test takers. First language acquisition, there are lots of theories, and all of them are based on the theory that there is an innate ability in every human being that you will learn the language, you acquire the language from just being exposed to the immediate context. Whatever language you're exposed to, you're going to acquire that. And that happens because of the massive exposure to the language that you have, and it happens before schooling begins. When it comes to second language environment, it's completely different. In second language environment, it's all to do with learning through classroom-based most of the time. And what you see over there is that you have to think about the learning itself, because learning a language is not just about the knowledge of grammar, sounds, and the syntactic, semantic rules that govern them. Language is something beyond that. Language, as we know, is a social phenomenon. The outcome of, this is the point, the outcome of learning must be successful communication. And that has to be for a given purpose, in this particular example, being successful at university. It is influenced by a lot of things, including our cultures, our thought processes, and social conventions. We heard earlier on from Africa and elsewhere that actually those social conventions, they are very important. And those are the ones that impact on language. What language learners need are appropriate opportunities to link their school-based learning with the real world of communication, which is in society. So for academic purposes, for example, the score on a test must show your availability and being ready to actually cope with academic discourse. Now, this is what needs to be thought about, and at every point in discussion, you have to have the minimum level of proficiency in order to cope with that. Now, how does it happen in terms of second language learning? The second language learning is a case that is typically embedded in schools, typically what you have, if you're lucky, you got 2-3 hours per week within the school system, and that if you go through that one, you see that there's limited resources available. And what this means is that in terms of the classroom, you don't have enough opportunities to actually do anything with that. And what you need is to engage better in communication. You do need, in order to be successful there, you need to have extra activities beyond classroom. And those requires communication, those requires extra curriculum, and that interaction between learners. And that's where there is a belief that, is it working? Yeah. There is a general belief that girls tend to be better in this sort of condition. They tend to do better with engagement, with interaction, and they can do those tasks extra curriculum. And that's what it shows in terms of the perspective. You've seen differences in the scores, but actually, as Agnieszka mentioned, the differences are negligible from a statistical perspective. There are differences, but they're not important. Now, what we can do is that with the data that actually we have, particularly in Cambridge, which is about not just the schools, it's about background information about the candidates, we are able to actually look at the variables, multiple factors, cultural and otherwise, that actually impact and can explain why the differences there are. The picture that we talked about, we know that there are differences, and we know that there are kind of impacted by many factors. Some of these factors are, as I said, they are sociocultural or economic factors. The question is that how do you go about, if you got the right information about them, how do you go about trying to understand what the differences are? Now, one of the things that's important to look at, Agnieszka mentioned that the data was, in a way, was affected or convoluted by the sheer number of the candidates in some Asian countries. So that was part of the reason you've seen that the girls were performing better. Now, there is an important factor over there. If you look at those countries, there's something about selection effect. The candidates who took the test, if you look at particularly the proportion from China and other Asian countries, you would notice that many of them come from the countries that actually they are the societies with known gender equity differences. So there are genuine equity differences in those countries. And it's possible that the women, now you've seen the score there, the women who were put for these exams to sit, they are the ones that are actually putting forward because they were ready. They didn't put everyone over there. When it came to male candidates, because it's the norm of the society that those male candidates were kind of preferred, it was the right to take the test, even if they were not ready. So that's a factor involved over there, and that possibly explains some of the reasons why the candidates who were scoring very low, who, with score of 4 and below, you're not going to get anywhere in any university. Why did you have those candidates in the population? Well, they were not going to lose anything. They had the privilege, so they sat the test anyway. Now, if we want to conclude, possibly what happens here is that we need to understand the cultural and behavioral changes within the candidature and the performance in the society at large. And what's important is to understand the motivation to work and also for a study. In this particular case, the candidates who are ready to actually do the study. And what needs to be done is to do more research using the resources that they are, understand all the other behavioral and cultural issues that may impact on how the candidates perform at tests. Thank you.